My daughter moved back in with me for 4 months, while her husband was between jobs, and in those 4 months, I cooked every meal, paid every utility bill, and watched my grocery budget get swallowed whole by a household that had suddenly doubled in size. I want you to hold that number for a second. 4 months. That's roughly 120 days of someone else's laundry in my machine, someone else's dishes in my sink, someone else's baby crying at 2 in the morning through walls I'd spent 30 years paying off. And when they finally got back on their feet and moved out, the thank you note I got was a text message with a sunflower emoji. A sunflower emoji. Then, 8 weeks later, my daughter called to tell me she needed $15,000 for a kitchen renovation because, and I quote, "It's really important for resale value, Mom. My name is Paula. I'm 53 years old. I work in hospital administration. And this is the story of how I finally understood something I should have understood years ago. That generosity without boundaries isn't love. It's just a habit that other people learn to depend on." It started on a Wednesday. I remember because Wednesdays are when I do my meal prep for the week, and I was standing at my kitchen counter portioning out chicken thighs when my daughter Britt called. She and her husband Theo had been struggling since his company downsized. She was crying before she even finished explaining, and I heard myself say, before I'd even thought it through, "Come stay with me, just until things stabilize." I want to be honest about what I expected. I expected 2 months, maybe 3. I expected it to be hard in the logistical way. The adjustments, the noise, the loss of my routine. I did not expect it to be hard in the way that it actually was, which was quieter and stranger and more corrosive than I had any way to prepare for. The first few weeks were fine, the way things are fine when everyone is still on good behavior. Britt helped with dishes. Theo said thank you at dinner. Their little one, my granddaughter Maisie, who had just turned 2, was genuinely the best part. She had this way of running toward me every morning, with her arms stretched out like I was the most important thing in the room. And I want to be clear, that part I would do again without hesitation. But somewhere around week 5, things shifted in ways I couldn't quite name at first. Theo stopped saying thank you at dinner. Britt started leaving Maisie with me on weekday afternoons without asking first, just mentioning it in passing as she grabbed her bag and headed for the door. The grocery bill climbed from my usual $200 a month to nearly $500, and when I mentioned it once, gently Britt said, "Mom, we're already dealing with so much stress. Can you not make this harder?" I didn't bring it up again. The utilities were another thing. Theo ran the heat warmer than I ever had. I keep it at 68, he kept nudging it to 72, and my electric bill in February was $40 higher than it had been the year before. When I mentioned it to Britt, she said, "We're family, Mom. We're not guests. You shouldn't be tracking every dollar with us." And the thing is, she said it in a tone that made me feel like the unreasonable one. Like the problem was my accounting and not the reality that my paycheck had not changed but my expenses had grown by a third. I've been a single mother since Britt was 11. I know how to stretch money. I know exactly what things cost. But somehow, in my own house, I was made to feel small for knowing. By month 3, I had stopped mentioning anything at all. I want to tell you something about that silence, because I think it matters. When you stop naming things, you don't stop noticing them. You just start carrying the weight of them alone. I would lie awake some nights running the arithmetic in my head. The groceries, the utilities, the birthday gift I'd bought Theo because Britt mentioned his birthday was coming up. The car repair I'd helped with, because Theo's check engine light came on, and they didn't have the cash. None of these things were enormous on their own. Together, over 4 months, I had absorbed somewhere around $3,000 in additional costs, without anyone acknowledging it, without anyone offering to chip in, without anyone asking whether I was doing okay carrying it. The month they moved out, I felt something I'm not proud of. I felt relief so strong it made me dizzy, and then immediately guilty for feeling it. This is my daughter, that's my granddaughter. You are not supposed to feel relief when they leave. But I did. The sunflower emoji text came the day after they got the keys to their new apartment. No call, no visit, no standing on my front porch with Maisie saying, "Wave goodbye to Grandma's house." Just a text, "Thank you for everything, Mom, you're the best." I read it standing in my kitchen, which was suddenly very quiet and also somehow still had Theo's protein powder on the counter because he'd forgotten it. I stood there for a minute and then I moved it to the trash and I went to bed. 8 weeks passed. I started to feel like myself again. I started meal prepping on Wednesdays without anyone interrupting. I slept through the night. I went back to keeping the heat at 68. Small things, but they accumulate into something recognizable. Your own life. And then, my phone rang on a Saturday morning and it was Brit. And she sounded the way she sounds when she wants something. Which is slightly too warm, like she's turned up a dial. Mom, so Theo and I have been thinking. And you know how the kitchen in the new place is kind of dated? We got a quote and we could really transform in the space. It would add so much value for when we eventually sell. But we're still rebuilding savings. So we were wondering if you could help us out. Like a loan, obviously. $15,000. I want you to understand what $15,000 means for someone like me. I'm not poor. I work full-time, I have a retirement account, I own my home. But I am also a woman who budgets carefully. Because I have to, because there is no other income coming in, because the margin between fine and not fine is thinner than most people with partners understand. $15,000 is nearly a quarter of what I have in liquid savings. It is not money I can hand over and forget about. And here's the thing that sent a cold feeling through my chest as she was talking. She didn't ask how I was doing first. Not one word about whether I'd been comfortable after they left, or whether I'd appreciated having my space back, or whether 4 months of extra expense had been manageable for me. The conversation opened with the ask. The family was calling because the family needed something. And apparently I was still the resource, just at a new address now. I told her I needed to think about it. She said, "Of course, take your time, but we kind of need to give them an answer by end of the month." Take your time, but there's a deadline. That's not take your time. That's pressure with a softer jacket on. I didn't call her back that day. I sat with it, the way you sit with things when you're 53. And you've learned that the first feeling isn't always the most useful one. The first feeling was anger. Under the anger was something sadder and more complicated. The particular grief of realizing your child has learned to see you as a solution to a problem, rather than a person to protect. I thought about what I would say. I drafted something in my head while I was weeding the garden that afternoon. A long, careful explanation of everything I had absorbed over 4 months, every dollar, every boundary that had been treated like an inconvenience. I thought about sending it and then I thought, she won't hear it. She'll defend it. She'll tell me I'm being unfair, that I'm keeping score, that I'm making her feel guilty for struggling. And then I'll spend 3 days managing her feelings about the conversation, instead of her actually hearing any of it. So I thought about what she deserved instead. Not cruelty, not a lecture, just an answer that matched the energy of the question. I texted her back the following Monday. 3 sentences, I thought about it, I'm not able to do the loan right now, I hope you find another way forward. That's it, no explanation, no apology, no softening it with a promise to revisit or a suggestion to check back in a few months. I put my phone in my bag and went to work. The response I got that evening was not 3 sentences. Britt called twice during my workday, which she knows I can't answer. Then texted, "Mom, I'm confused. What does not able to mean? Are you serious?" Then called again at 5:15 when she knew I'd be off. I let it ring. I was still processing my own quiet, which is harder to maintain than it sounds when you've spent 30 years being the person who picks up every call. She left a voicemail. I'll paraphrase. She was hurt. She felt blindsided. She thought after everything they'd been through I would want to help them. She didn't understand why I was being cold. Cold. I turned that word over in my mind for a long time. I had housed her family for 4 months. I had fed them, kept them warm, watched their daughter absorb thousands of dollars in costs without complaint, sent them off with a smile and a hug when they finally moved out, and declining to hand over $15,000 for a kitchen renovation that I could not afford was cold. I texted back that evening, just one line, "I love you." The answer is still no. She didn't respond that night. Theo sent me a message the next morning that surprised me. Actually, it was longer than I expected and more wounded than I anticipated. He talked about how they were trying so hard, how the kitchen really did affect their quality of life, how they'd thought of me as safety net through all of this, how it hurt to feel like the net was suddenly gone. The safety net. I sat with those 3 words for a long time. Not with anger, actually, with something closer to clarity. Because a safety net is what you put under someone who might fall. A safety net is not what you call the person whose house you lived in for 4 months without contributing a dollar, whose grocery bills you ran up without noticing, who handed over her quiet and her routine, and her Wednesday nights, and got a sunflower emoji in return. That's not a safety net, that's a foundation. And foundations hold things up silently, invisibly, and nobody talks about them until they need to be rebuilt. I didn't respond to Theo. For 2 weeks, things were quiet in the way that arguments get quiet, not resolved, just paused, both sides waiting to see who blinks. I went to my Wednesday meal prep. I turned the heat to 68. I slept through the night. My friend Adele, who I've known since our kids were in elementary school together, came over for dinner and I told her the whole thing. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her best qualities, and when I finished she said, "Do you want my honest opinion?" I said yes. She said, "The loan was never the problem. The loan is just the first time you said no, and they don't know how to handle it." She was right, but it wasn't until 2 weeks after that conversation that I found out just how right she was, and in a way I hadn't seen coming. My sister Rochelle called me on a Thursday evening. Rochelle lives 3 states away. We talk every week or two. She's the kind of person who brings things up gently even when they're not gentle things. She started with, "So I talked to Britt yesterday." I said okay. She said, "Honey, she's been calling around." Calling around? I asked Rochelle what that meant. What it meant, as Rochelle laid it out carefully, was that Britt had called our mother. My 81-year-old mother who lives on a fixed Social Security income in a 1-bedroom apartment, to discuss whether Grandma might be able to help with the kitchen renovation. She had also called Rochelle to say that I had cut them off, and that I was punishing them for struggling, and had apparently framed the entire conversation in a way that left out the 4 months they had lived in my home, the costs I had carried, and the fact that the thing I had declined to fund was a kitchen renovation, not groceries or rent or a medical bill. I felt the blood drain out of my face while Rochelle was talking. Not because Britt had called around. I could almost understand that. The desperation of wanting something and not knowing what to do with a no. What stopped me cold was the specific shape of the story she was telling. She had described me as punishing them. She had apparently told my mother that I had changed and become difficult to be around since they moved out, implying that my refusal was evidence of some shift in my character, rather than a reasonable financial boundary. She had taken a story in which she was the one asking for $15,000, 8 weeks after moving out of my home, and turned it into a story in which I was the problem. I asked Rochelle if she'd told our mother her version. Rochelle said she had tried to give context, but that Mom was confused and worried, and had already started asking whether she could take some money out of her account. My 81-year-old mother on a fixed income was sitting in her apartment wondering if she needed to sacrifice her own cushion because the story she'd been told suggested I had abandoned my daughter. I want you to understand what that felt like. I have protected my mother from financial anxiety my entire adult life. When her roof needed repairs 2 years ago, I paid for half without telling her the full cost. When her car battery died last winter, I drove 3 hours to take care of it. She has never once needed to open her wallet for me, and the thought of her sitting there at 81, worried, possibly about to deplete her own safety margin because of a version of events that had been curated to make me look like a villain. That wasn't just hurtful. That was something I could not let stand. I thought about how to respond for exactly 1 day. I thought about the kind of response that explains everything, that lays out a timeline, that presents evidence. I thought about how exhausting that would be to receive, and how easy it would be to dismiss. And then I thought about what I actually needed. Not for everyone to know my side. I needed my mother to be safe, and I needed people who'd been given half a story to have access to the other half. I didn't post anything dramatic. I didn't send a group message to the extended family. What I did was call my mother directly. I called her on a Friday morning. She answered on the second ring, the way she always does, because she keeps the phone close ever since my father passed. I asked her how she was doing. She said she was fine, a little worried. I asked her what she was worried about. She told me, in her careful way, that Britt had called, and that she was concerned there was some tension and she'd offered to help, because that's what she does. She helps. I said. Mom, I need to tell you exactly what happened from the beginning, and I need you to just listen before you respond. Can you do that? She said yes. I told her everything. Not in an emotional way. I kept my voice even, the same tone I use at work when I'm walking someone through a situation that needs to be heard clearly. I told her about the 4 months. About the grocery bills. About the utilities. About the sunflower emoji. About the $15,000 ask that came 8 weeks later, with no acknowledgement of anything that had come before. About the voicemail where Britt had called me cold. About what Rochelle had told me. My mother was quiet for a long time when I finished. Long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then she said, "Baby, I had no idea any of that happened." I said, "I know you didn't, that's why I'm calling." She said she wasn't going to give Britt any money. I told her I wasn't asking her to make any decisions based on our conversation. Just to have the full picture. She said, "I have the full picture now." And then she said, "You should have called me sooner." She was right about that. I then wrote Rochelle a long email. Not angry, just thorough. I laid out the timeline the way I'd laid it out for my mother. I included, because I'd kept them, a few screenshots of text exchanges from during the 4 months. The one where Britt told me not to make things harder by mentioning groceries. The one where Theo said I shouldn't track dollars with family. The one where I got the sunflower emoji. Not to prosecute a case, just to offer evidence that the version of the story Britt had shared was missing significant chapters. Rochelle called me after she read it. She said, "Paula, I didn't know." I said, "I know. Almost nobody did, because I didn't say anything at the time. I'm saying something now." The fallout, as I heard about it over the following weeks through Rochelle and through my mother, was quieter than I might have expected. There was no dramatic confrontation. My mother called Britt and told her, gently but clearly, that she'd heard my side of things and wasn't going to help with the renovation. Rochelle stopped being a sympathetic ear for Britt's version of events, which I think was actually more significant than any of the rest of it. When the audience goes away, the performance changes. Britt called me once more. About 3 weeks after the Friday I called my mother. It was a shorter call than I expected. She said she hadn't meant to make things difficult. I said I knew. She said she didn't realize how much I'd been absorbing financially. I said that was, in part, because I hadn't said so at the time, and that was something I was working on changing. She asked if we could move past it. I said I hoped so. But that moving past it didn't mean pretending it hadn't happened, and that some things were going to be different going forward. Specifically that I would be naming things as they came up rather than absorbing them silently. She didn't love that answer. But she didn't fight it either. As for the kitchen renovation, they didn't do it. At least not yet. From what my mother told me, they're looking at a much smaller update. Some paint and new cabinet hardware. Things they can actually afford on their own. Which, honestly, is what I would have suggested from the beginning if anyone had asked me as a person rather than approached me as a funding source. It's been about 4 months since all of this unfolded. I talk to Britt most weeks. We are not back to where we were before, and I'm not certain we will be. At least not to the version of that relationship, where she operated under the comfortable assumption that my resources had no limit. And my silence meant consent. What we're building instead is something more honest, which is harder but also more real. I still do my Wednesday meal prep. The kitchen is mine, the heat stays at 68, and last week Britt actually called ahead before asking if she could drop Maisie off on Saturday afternoon. I said yes, and meant it completely. Maisie ran in with her arms stretched out, the same way she always has, and that part hasn't changed at all. What I think about sometimes, in the evenings when the house is quiet, is how long I had been fluent in the language of absorbing things without naming them. How natural it had felt for years to keep the peace by making myself smaller. How much energy I had spent anticipating other people's needs, and how little I had spent saying, "And here is what I need back." I don't think Britt is a bad person. I don't think she woke up deciding to take advantage of me. I think she learned, across a lifetime of watching me manage things quietly, that the things would always be managed. That's not malice. That's a lesson I taught her by example. Every single time I chose silence over specificity. The difference now is that I've stopped teaching that class. So here's what I want to ask you. Because I've thought about it more than I probably should. If your family moved in for 4 months, ran up your bills, moved out with a sunflower emoji, and then called 8 weeks later for $15,000 for a kitchen upgrade, would you have said, no sooner than I did? Or would you have done what I did, and kept going, and hoped that someone would eventually notice without being told? If you've ever been the person in your family who manages things quietly, you already know exactly where this story lives. This has been Mara Payback. New stories every single day.